They never existed. At least that's what the official records say. No flags, no ceremonies, no public decorations, just silence. But for decades, American soldiers reported the same unsettling feeling. Something was moving in the shadows of the Soviet bloc. Something trained to act where no one else could admit its presence, and the question that echoed behind the scenes of the Cold War wasn't whether they existed, but how far they were willing to go. At the height of tensions between Washington and Moscow, while the world watched missiles, speeches, and nuclear threats, another war was raging far from the cameras. It wasn't being fought in vast open fields, nor announced in official communiques. It was an invisible war, waged by men who had no public identity. Men who, if captured, would simply cease to exist on paper. The name that circulated in internal reports, intelligence analyses, and barracks rumors was only one: Spetsnaz. Officially, they were just special forces, but for those who studied Soviet movements closely, something was different. Training that wasn't described in common manuals, units deployed without explanation, operations that appeared in unstable regions of the world and disappeared before any confirmation could be made. Former American military personnel who served in Europe reported indirect encounters, signs of infiltration, silent sabotage, nothing concrete enough for a formal accusation, but enough to raise a persistent suspicion. Someone was always one step ahead. What made it all the more unsettling was not just the efficiency, but the absolute silence. While American forces were recognized, honored, and studied, these Soviet units seemed to operate outside the very logic of traditional military life. No propaganda, no public medals, no official recognition. Why would a government hide its own warriors? What demanded this level of plausible deniability? Declassified reports years later revealed fragments. Extreme training in the frozen environments of Siberia. Capture and resistance simulations that pushed known psychological limits, infiltration exercises into foreign territory under civilian identity. None of this was entirely illegal. None of it was officially proven. But the sum of the evidence created a disturbing picture. These men were being prepared not only to fight, but to disappear. During the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, reports emerged of swift, surgical operations conducted even before conventional troops entered the scene. Strategic points neutralized, local leaders eliminated with precision, communications disrupted without clear explanation. Who carried out these initial actions? The public version spoke of regular units. But Western analysts pointed to something more sophisticated, more silent, more highly trained. And then there was the psychological factor. The mere possibility of an invisible force existing was, in itself, a weapon. American soldiers stationed in West Germany knew that in the event of open conflict, they would not only face armored divisions, there would be infiltration, there would be sabotage. There would be men trained to operate behind the lines even before the first official shot was fired. This perception altered strategies, changed protocols, and created constant tension. But here an uncomfortable question arises. If these units were so secret, how do we know so much about them? The answer is unsettling. We only know fragments, excerpts from interviews after the collapse of the Soviet Union, isolated accounts from former members, partially released documents. Enough to confirm that highly trained special forces existed, but not enough to reveal everything they did. Some historians argue that the mystery is exaggerated, that every great power maintains covert operations. This is true. However, the Soviet difference seemed to lie in scale and absolute denial. It wasn't just operational secrecy. It was the deliberate construction of an entity that could act without leaving an institutional trace. A military ghost. What if the true function of these units wasn't just to execute missions, but to test limits, to test how far the West could detect invisible movements, to test the psychological resilience of opponents who knew something was there, but could never fully prove it? This invisible war eroded trust, created strategic paranoia, and fueled decisions based on fear of the unknown. For many American patriots who served during that period, the confrontation was not merely ideological. It was existential. It was the defense of a worldview against a system that also operated in the shadows. While one side publicly exalted its heroes, the other seemed to mold its combatants like disposable pieces on a larger chessboard. But there's a detail that's rarely discussed. If some of these operations were never officially acknowledged, it means that some stories will never be fully told. How many missions were carried out under false identities? How many indirect confrontations occurred without the public knowing? How many American strategic decisions were influenced by movements that remain classified to this day? The Cold War officially ended in 1991. The Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin, archives were opened, others were destroyed. In the midst of this collapse, many members of these units simply disappeared from the public radar. Some were incorporated into modern Russian forces, others followed unknown paths, and some, according to persistent rumors, remained active in restructured structures. If they never officially existed, how can we claim they ceased to exist? This question is not rhetorical, it is strategic, because understanding the past is understanding the present. And perhaps the greatest mistake is believing that the end of a flag means the end of everything that was built in the shadows. In the next part, we will delve into the selection process of these men and discover how a system was able to transform ordinary recruits into operators prepared for a war that would never appear in the newspapers. If they didn't exist on the surface, behind the scenes someone had to choose them, and this is where the mystery deepens, because forming an invisible unit requires more than physical strength. It requires men capable of operating without recognition, without glory, and if necessary, without return. During the Cold War, while young Americans trained to defend their homeland with honor and a clear identity, on the other side of the Iron Curtain, there was a selection process that began in silence and ended in isolation. Reports that surfaced after the collapse of the Soviet Union describe how many Spetsnaz candidates were identified while still in mandatory military service. It wasn't enough to be strong. They needed to demonstrate resistance to extreme cold, absolute obedience, and the ability to act under severe deprivation. In regions of Siberia, where winter is unforgiving, training simulated sleepless days, long marches through deep snow, and psychological tests designed to break down any trace of hesitation. The implicit question wasn't, "Can you fight?" but "Can you disappear?" For the viewer who has served in the American Armed Forces, imagine the moment you first donned your uniform. There was purpose, there was an oath, there was the flag. Now imagine the opposite. Being prepared to serve without your country ever officially recognizing your mission. This contrast helps to understand the profound cultural difference between the two systems. While in the United States, military service is linked to public values and national identity, in that Soviet model, many operators were trained as silent instruments of a state that did not tolerate failure. There are accounts of exercises that simulated capture in enemy territory. Recruits were subjected to mock interrogations, sensory deprivation, and prolonged isolation. Some gave up, others remained. Those who resisted moved on to an even more restricted phase, where they learned urban infiltration, sabotage, and operations behind enemy lines. All of this occurred away from the cameras, away from propaganda. The goal was not to inspire the Soviet people, but to create an invisible, strategic advantage. During the 1980s, when American soldiers were stationed in West Germany, many trained daily for the scenario of a conventional Soviet advance. Tanks, artillery, mechanized divisions. But planners knew that before any open offensive, something different would happen. Bridges could be sabotaged, communication centers could be neutralized, leaders could be targeted in precise attacks. This scenario wasn't paranoia. It was strategic planning based on the existence of these units. There's a recurring story told by military analysts of the time. In NATO exercises, certain simulated failures were introduced to test responses. Disrupted communications, fictitious infiltration of logistics bases, energy sabotage. The exercise revealed an uncomfortable truth. The fear of an invisible force altered decisions even before the real confrontation. The psychological impact was part of the equation, and that was perhaps one of the greatest weapons of these units. But here a question arises that connects the past to the viewer's daily life. How many times in civilian life have you felt the pressure of something you couldn't see but knew was there? An approaching economic crisis, a diffuse threat, an invisible risk. This feeling is powerful. It shapes behavior. In the Cold War, this was precisely the strategic function of forces like Spetsnaz, to create constant uncertainty. Some reports indicate that the training included adaptation to multiple languages and false identities. Operators were prepared to cross borders as ordinary civilians. This capability broadened the reach of operations, and for those defending the free world, this represented a real threat, because the line between battlefield and home territory became more blurred. However, it's important to maintain historical perspective. All major powers have developed special forces. The United States also possesses highly trained and discreet units. The difference lay in the narrative and relative transparency. The American model values its operators as national heroes, even when many missions remain classified. The Soviet model, on the other hand, seemed to prioritize the deliberate erasure of these men's identities. This erasure creates a moral dilemma that still resonates. What happens to a soldier trained to act without recognition when the war ends? After 1991, many files were fragmented. Some former members gave interviews, but always in a controlled manner. Others never spoke. It is possible that many returned to ordinary life, carrying experiences they could never fully share. And perhaps that's the most unsettling part. It's not just about covert operations. It's about training individuals to operate in strategic darkness. Men prepared to carry out orders that would never be officially acknowledged. In a world where information is power, silence is also a weapon. If the selection process already revealed extreme discipline and strategic depersonalization, the next step was even more complex. Because selecting and training is only the beginning. The real question is where and how these men were used when the world was distracted by diplomatic speeches and nuclear threats. In the next part, we will delve into operations that never received official confirmation, but which silently changed strategic decisions behind the scenes of history. There are wars that begin long before the first shot is fired, before the press records any movement, before leaders make fiery speeches, before flags are raised. In the case of Soviet special units, many of the most decisive operations occurred in that invisible space between diplomatic tension and open confrontation. They were not formal invasions. They were surgical, swift movements designed to alter the strategic balance without leaving a mark. During the 1979 invasion of Afghanistan, one specific operation marked the modern doctrine of these forces. Before conventional troops could occupy positions, a highly trained group seized the Taj Beg Palace, the residence of President Hafizullah Amin. The action was swift, coordinated, and lethal. The objective was not only to eliminate a leader considered unstable, but to secure immediate political control. The implicit message was clear. Before the world could react, the deed would already be done. And here arises the first question that should concern us. How many other similar operations have occurred without our even knowing about them? Western reports from the time indicated unusual movements in strategic regions of Africa, Central America, and Eastern Europe. Soviet military instructors officially appeared to train allies, but in parallel there were indications of smaller teams conducting specific missions. Sabotage of infrastructure, neutralization of opposition leaders, deep intelligence gathering. There was not always confirmation, but there were patterns, and patterns in strategy are rarely coincidental. Now imagine this scenario. You wake up to go to work, take your children to school, turn on the television, and hear that a foreign government changed overnight. There was no major battle broadcast live, just an abrupt transition of power. What happened in the hours before? That's the nature of silent operations. They shape the world while most people are distracted by their daily routines. How many global decisions have been influenced by actions that never came to public knowledge? In Europe, during the height of the Cold War, there was a specific fear within NATO's planning. In the event of open conflict, it was believed that Soviet units would already be infiltrated into Western territory even before the first conventional offensive. Reports indicated training in sabotaging power grids, logistics centers, and strategic communications. It wasn't just physical warfare. It was structural paralysis, and the inevitable question arises again. If the objective was to act before the official declaration of war, how could they prove that these actions took place? Some military analysts suggest that part of the Soviet strategy was to test Western responses through limited, almost experimental operations. Small incidents, mysterious failures, ambiguous movements. Each American reaction served as data collection. In modern terms, it would be like probing an adversary's digital security before a larger attack. Except that back then, the battlefield was both physical and psychological. What if part of the effectiveness of these units lay precisely in the ambiguity? Not confirming was part of the game. Officially denying offered diplomatic leeway. This logic created an uncomfortable scenario for American strategists. How to respond proportionally to something that cannot be officially attributed. This tension shaped important political decisions in the 1980s. Do you realize how silence can be as powerful as an explosion? Another point rarely discussed is the adaptation of these forces to different cultural environments. There are records of operators trained to assimilate regional languages and local behaviors. In operations in Africa, for example, reports suggest temporary integration with local forces to maximize effectiveness. This flexibility extended Soviet reach far beyond traditional borders, and again, expectations are broken. We are not just talking about elite soldiers, but about mobile strategic pieces on a global chessboard. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, although there is no direct evidence of specific actions by these units, later analysts suggest that special teams were prepared to act should negotiations fail. The mere possibility altered strategic calculations. The invisible presence of operators trained for rapid action added a layer of complexity to the nuclear confrontation. How many decisions made in that critical week considered this silent factor? It is important to maintain historical clarity. Many of these operations remain classified or only partially documented. What we have are fragments, analyses, and indirect accounts. However, when these fragments come together, they form a consistent picture of covert and strategic action. This is not fantasy. It is about recognizing that the Cold War was fought on multiple levels simultaneously. And here is the central point that few discuss. If covert operations were so decisive in that period, what is the legacy of that doctrine today? Strategies don't disappear with the fall of a regime. They evolve, they adapt, and history shows that knowledge accumulated over decades doesn't simply dissolve with the changing of flags. So pause for a moment and reflect. When we look at modern conflicts, at sudden instabilities, at seemingly unexpected geopolitical shifts, are we really seeing the whole picture? Or is there still an underlying layer of decisions made outside the public eye? In the next part, we will explore how psychological warfare and strategic manipulation have become perhaps the most powerful weapon of these forces, transforming fear and uncertainty into instruments of silent power. There is a type of combat that doesn't leave craters, but leaves deep scars on the mind. While tanks and planes dominated the news, another front advanced almost imperceptibly: psychological warfare. For Soviet special units, the objective was not just to eliminate a target or conquer territory. It was to plant doubt, create constant tension, and alter decisions before the enemy even realized they were under attack. This invisible dimension was, perhaps, one of the most sophisticated of the Cold War. Military studies indicate that during the 1980s, more than 60% of NATO's strategic exercises included sabotage and infiltration simulations before any conventional offensive. This number didn't appear out of nowhere. It reflected a real concern about the possibility of stealth operations. The mere hypothesis that power grids, command centers, or logistical routes could be neutralized in hours already demanded extra protocols, heightened surveillance, and constant training. In other words, fear-shaped planning. And shaping the adversary's planning is a strategic victory before direct confrontation. There are documented accounts of disinformation campaigns conducted by the Soviet bloc that sought to undermine public trust in the West. Historians point to influence operations that spread rumors about political instability, internal crises, or fabricated scandals. The goal was not to completely convince, but to generate noise, to create distraction. If part of the population questions its own institutions, cohesion weakens, and here an important contrast emerges. While the American model values transparency, a free press, and public debate, closed regimes could exploit this openness as a strategic vulnerability. Imagine an American soldier stationed in Europe in 1985. He trains every day, maintains discipline, and believes in what he stands for. At the same time, he hears rumors of invisible infiltrations, possible sabotage, and agents operating under civilian identities. This tension is not just physical, it's psychological. It demands constant emotional preparedness. And it is precisely at this point that American culture has demonstrated historical strength. The belief in clear values, a transparent chain of command, and public accountability served as an antidote to widespread fear. A little discussed fact is that the Soviet budget for intelligence and covert operations grew significantly in the final decades of the Cold War, even when the domestic economy was already showing signs of weakness. This indicates strategic priority. Investing in invisible warfare was more efficient than directly confronting an industrial superpower like the United States. It was a way to compensate for structural disadvantages through asymmetric operations. But there is a story that exemplifies this dynamic well. During NATO military exercises, certain scenarios simulated a total interruption of communications for hours. In some cases, officers reported that the initial reaction was one of tactical confusion. However, American doctrine evolved to reinforce redundancy and rapid adaptation. The response to this invisible threat was to further strengthen structural resilience. In other words, the attempt to generate disorder ended up encouraging greater preparedness. This demonstrates a central characteristic of American military culture, learning from the threat and transforming vulnerability into strength. Another unexpected element is the symbolic importance of official Soviet denial. By never fully admitting certain operations, an almost mythical aura was created around these units. The mystery amplified the perception of power. Psychologically, the unknown is more frightening than the known. However, there is a limit to this strategy. When secrecy becomes excessive, it also generates internal distrust. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, part of the population itself discovered the extent of operations that had never been publicly discussed. The impact was twofold: external surprise and internal questioning. For today's viewer, it's important to connect this story to the present. In a world where information circulates in seconds, psychological warfare has evolved into the digital environment. However, the logic remains the same: to confuse, divide, and test limits. The difference is that today, the battlefield includes social networks, data, and public perception on a global scale. The question that needs to be asked is simple. Are we more prepared or just more exposed? Modern statistics show that digital influence campaigns can reach millions of people in just a few hours. This expands the reach of strategies that began decades ago. What once required physical infiltration can now be done through informational manipulation. This historical continuity reinforces the importance of understanding the past, not to fuel fear, but to strengthen strategic awareness. Throughout the Cold War, American culture was based on the idea that freedom requires constant vigilance. This vigilance is not only military, but also civic. While closed regimes relied on opacity as a tool of power, the democratic model responded with transparency and continuous adaptation. This structural difference was decisive in the outcome of the global conflict. However, one question remains. If part of the strength of these units lay in invisible manipulation and psychological impact, to what extent are we still only seeing the surface of modern strategies? What we learned from that period is that the most decisive battlefield may not be the physical one, but the mental one. And in the next part, we will delve into the most controversial rumors, parallel programs, and ethical boundaries that may have been crossed in the name of strategic supremacy. Some secrets don't appear on maps. They are kept in underground corridors, in reports with blacked-out sections, and in memories that were never officially recorded. As the Cold War moved into its most tense years, rumors began to circulate not only about silent operations, but about parallel programs that went beyond the traditional battlefield. It wasn't just about training soldiers for infiltration, it was about expanding human limits. Fragmented reports indicate that certain Soviet military installations operated far from major urban centers, in isolated regions of Siberia and Kazakhstan. Officially, they were training and research centers. Unofficially, Western analysts suspected that extreme levels of physical and mental endurance were tested there. Prolonged sleep deprivation, controlled exposure to severe cold, simulations of contaminated environments. The apparent objective was simple: to create operators who would remain functional when anyone else would have already collapsed. For a former American soldier, this provokes inevitable reflection. Rigorous training is part of the formation of any elite force. Rangers, SEALs, Delta Force all undergo tests that push human limits. The difference here was in the opacity. In the United States, even if operational details are classified, there is public acknowledgement of the existence of these units. In the Soviet model, however, secrecy was so profound that the very institutional identity was diluted. This raises an uncomfortable question. How far can a state go when it doesn't have to answer to its own population? During the 1980s, intelligence documents mentioned Soviet studies on radiation resistance and physiological adaptation in hostile environments. Some of this was linked to the nuclear context of the time. In a scenario of limited atomic conflict, units capable of operating in contaminated areas would have a strategic advantage. Although many details remain classified or incomplete, the fact that such research was considered already demonstrates the level of preparedness for extreme scenarios. But there's something even more intriguing. Some defectors reported intense psychological conditioning programs in which operators were subjected to prolonged isolation and extreme stress manipulation to assess absolute loyalty. The idea was to eliminate any moral hesitation in the face of critical orders. We're not talking about science fiction. We're talking about a geopolitical context where the regime's survival was seen as an absolute priority. The question that naturally arises is, when loyalty is shaped by continuous pressure, what remains of individuality? Meanwhile, on the American side, the strengthening of special forces occurred with a different logic. Excellence was built on clear values, discipline, merit, and national identity. The relative transparency of the system created cohesion and pride. This structural contrast directly influenced the final outcome of the Cold War. Systems that rely exclusively on absolute secrecy tend to corrode from within. Systems that combine operational secrecy with public legitimacy have a more stable foundation. Another little discussed element involves the integration between special forces and military research laboratories. In the Soviet Union, the boundary between science and strategy was highly centralized. Projects focused on physical enhancement, pain resistance, and adaptation to extreme conditions received priority funding. There is no evidence of large-scale illegal experiments, but there is evidence that the pursuit of tactical advantage included aggressively exploiting physiological limits. Imagine a scenario where an operator is trained to operate for days in sub-zero temperatures without immediate logistical support while maintaining strategic decision-making capacity. This alters the calculations of any adversary. It's not just about brute force, it's about the ability to persist where others would retreat. This logic explains why many American analysts considered these units a real threat, even when absolute numbers were relatively small. At the same time, the Soviet economic collapse in the late 1980s brought a paradox. Massive investments in secret structures coexisted with growing internal shortages. The strategic priority was clear: maintain an invisible military advantage, even under economic pressure. This choice came at a high political cost. When the Soviet Union fell, some of these programs were abruptly terminated. Archives disappeared, facilities were abandoned or reconfigured, and then comes the most unsettling point in this story. Accumulated knowledge doesn't disappear. Techniques developed over decades aren't erased with the signing of a treaty. Operators trained under this doctrine remained alive. Some were incorporated into modern Russian forces, others migrated to private security sectors. The legacy wasn't destroyed, it was transformed. What does this mean for the present? It means that understanding these parallel programs is not just looking at the past with historical curiosity. It's understanding how certain strategic mindsets evolve. American culture won the Cold War not only through military strength, but through a combination of economic power, technological innovation, and institutional legitimacy. Still, ignoring the complexity of the adversary would be naive. The mystery surrounding these units lay not only in the missions they carried out, but in the very logic that underpinned them. Operating in the shadows, testing human limits, and expanding ethical boundaries in the name of strategic supremacy. This mentality shaped decisions that continue to resonate. Now, one question remains unanswered. If some of these programs were hidden for decades and only partially came to light after the Soviet collapse, how many chapters remain locked away? And more importantly, how does this invisible legacy influence conflicts and strategies in today's world? In the final part, we will confront the legacy of these units after the fall of the Soviet Union and face the question that many prefer to avoid: what really ended in 1991 and what merely changed its name? The red flag is lowered from the Kremlin. The world watches the collapse of a superpower. Analysts celebrate the end of the Cold War. Headlines speak of a new era of cooperation, of reconstruction. Apparently, the conflict is over, but invisible wars don't end with public ceremonies. While cameras recorded leaders signing agreements, something quieter was happening behind the scenes. Files were selected, some released, others destroyed. Many simply disappeared. Military installations changed names, units were reorganized. Operators returned home or were reassigned. And here's the point few confront: when a secret structure is officially dissolved, it doesn't mean the accumulated knowledge has been erased. Think of any highly trained special forces unit. Years of experience, refined doctrine, techniques tested under real pressure. This type of strategic capital isn't lost with a change of flag. It's absorbed, reshaped, adapted. The question isn't whether these units continue to exist. The question is in what format they began to operate. In the years following the Soviet collapse, regional conflicts arose with unexpected speed. Some operations displayed familiar traits: extreme speed, plausible deniability, lack of official confirmation. Western observers recognized patterns. They weren't definitive proof, but they were echoes of a doctrine shaped during the Cold War. And then comes the emotional contrast that changes the whole perspective. For decades, the American public lived under the constant tension of a clear, ideological adversary. There was a defined line. There were two blocks. There was identification of the enemy. Today, the scenario is more diffuse. The invisible war hasn't disappeared. It has evolved. It's not limited to physical borders. It involves information, influence, perception. Here's the twist that few realize. Perhaps the greatest legacy of these units lies not in physical operations, but in the strategic mindset they left as a global inheritance. The logic of acting in the shadows, testing limits, exploiting diplomatic ambiguities, and manipulating public perception has become standard in modern conflicts. The game has changed, but the essence remains. Should this generate fear? No. it should generate awareness. American culture won the Cold War because it upheld something stronger than absolute secrecy. It upheld innovation, institutional transparency, and adaptability. While closed regimes depended on opacity to survive, the United States strengthened alliances, technology, and economic power. It was this combination that tipped the balance of history. But complacency has always been the greatest risk for any victorious nation. When we analyze the present, we realize that the battle for influence continues. It's no longer just military, it's informational, it's psychological, it's strategic. The question that remains is not whether there are forces operating in the shadows. There always have been. The real question is, are we attentive enough to recognize when old patterns reappear in new forms? Perhaps the real mystery was never the existence of these units. Perhaps the real mystery is how they shaped the modern form of conflict without most people realizing it. The Cold War officially ended, but the strategic competition never ceased, and here is the inevitable climax of this story. If some of these structures have been maintained, adapted, or transformed, then the past is not merely historical memory. It is a strategic manual. Every doctrine created, every technique tested, every silent operation has left a trace that still influences global decisions. The unsettling feeling that has lingered for decades, that sense that something was stirring in the shadows, never completely disappeared. It has simply shifted its setting. Today, the difference is that the battlefield now includes digital networks, global supply chains, and narrative disputes on a worldwide scale. The final question for you is direct and personal. If history shows that invisible warfare is real and persistent, what is the role of a free society in the face of it? Vigilance, information, engagement, conscious patriotism, not based on fear, but on strategic understanding. Because understanding the past isn't about reliving the tension. It's about avoiding repeating mistakes. If you've made it this far, it's because you understand that this story goes beyond historical curiosity. It touches on the essence of how nations compete, survive, and shape the future, and there are still chapters that need to be explored. If you want to continue delving into these topics, analyzing documents, covert operations, and strategies that shape the modern world, subscribe to the channel now. Like this video so that more people have access to this type of content. And most importantly, leave your opinion in the comments. Did you live through this period? Did you serve in the armed forces? Do you remember the tension of that time? Share your experience or your questions. History is made of facts, but also of memories, and your perspective can enrich this debate. The next story might be closer to the present than you think.